Most people aren't lazy, they're not unintelligent, they're not unlucky. They work hard. They worry about the right things. They know, on some level, what they should be doing. And yet, year after year, the same patterns, the same conversations, the same distance between where they are and where they keep saying they want to be, not because they don't care, but because something keeps getting in the way. Something that isn't a lack of information, something that isn't a lack of effort, something quieter than that. Something most people never identify because they're too busy looking for the problem somewhere else. Today we're going to look at it directly, not to judge, not to fix everything in one conversation, but because understanding what actually holds people back is the first step towards something different. Let's begin. There's a pattern that shows up everywhere, in finances, in careers, in relationships, in health. It doesn't discriminate by income or education or intelligence. It affects people who read all the right books, people who know exactly what they should be doing, people who have tried, genuinely tried, more than once. The pattern looks like this. Someone identifies something they want to change. They feel motivated. They start. And then, at some point, they stop. Not dramatically, not with a decision. They just slow down, find reasons to wait, tell themselves they'll get back to it. And eventually the thing they were going to do becomes the thing they were going to do. Past tense, again. Sound familiar? Most people experience this and conclude the same thing, that they lack discipline, that they're not the kind of person who follows through, that there's something fundamentally wrong with their ability to change. And that conclusion, that quiet, devastating conclusion, is almost always wrong. The problem isn't discipline. It's something that looks like discipline from the outside, but operates at a completely different level. Let me explain. Discipline is about action, about doing the thing when you don't feel like it, about pushing through resistance. And discipline matters, but it's not the foundation. The foundation is something else entirely. It's identity, the way you see yourself, the story you tell about who you are, the beliefs you hold, often without knowing you hold them, about what's possible for someone like you. Here's what the research consistently shows. People don't behave their way to new beliefs. They believe their way to new behaviors. Let that sit for a moment. If you believe, somewhere deep and unexamined, that you're not the kind of person who builds wealth, no amount of budgeting apps or investment accounts will change that, not permanently. Because every time you get close to changing, the identity pulls you back, like a rubber band snapping back to its original shape. This is why people who win the lottery often end up broke within a few years. It's not because they're irresponsible, it's because their identity, their deep sense of who they are in relation to money, hasn't changed. And identity always wins, always. So the question isn't, why can't I stay disciplined? The real question is, who do I believe I am? Because everything else flows from the answer to that question. Your spending habits, your saving habits, your willingness to take calculated risks, your ability to delay gratification. All of it is downstream of identity, not downstream of information, not downstream of motivation, not downstream of willpower, downstream of the story you tell yourself about who you are. And here's the difficult part. Most of that story was written a long time ago, by experiences you may not even remember clearly, by things people said to you when you were young, by watching how the adults around you related to money, by the conclusions you drew as a child about what people like you do and don't deserve. Those conclusions became beliefs. Those beliefs became identity. And that identity has been quietly running the show ever since. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently, pulling you back every time you get close to something different. This isn't fatalism, it's not a life sentence. But it is the thing most people never look at. Because it's easier to blame circumstances, easier to blame the market, easier to blame timing, easier to say, I just need more discipline, than to ask the harder question, who do I believe I am? And is that belief still serving me? Let me tell you about 3 traps. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that make headlines or appear in cautionary tales, the quiet ones, the ones that look completely reasonable from the inside. The first trap is called the preparation trap. It sounds like this. I'm almost ready. I just need to learn a little more. Once I understand it better, I'll start. The preparation trap is seductive because it feels like progress. You're reading, you're researching, you're thinking carefully, all of which are genuinely valuable things, until they become a way of avoiding the moment when you actually have to do something. And here's the subtle cruelty of the preparation trap. The more you prepare without acting, the more you feel like you need to prepare before acting. The threshold keeps moving. Almost ready becomes a permanent state, a comfortable distance from the discomfort of actually beginning. Because beginning means risking failure, and failure means confronting the identity question we talked about earlier. Am I really the kind of person who can do this? Preparation lets you avoid finding out indefinitely. The second trap is the comparison trap. Someone you know is doing better than you. Maybe they started earlier. Maybe they had advantages you didn't. Maybe they just got lucky at the right moment. And instead of using that as information, as evidence that what you want is possible, it becomes evidence of your own inadequacy. The gap between where they are and where you are stops feeling like a distance to close and starts feeling like proof of something. Proof that you're behind, proof that it's too late, proof that the game is rigged against people like you. And once you believe that, action feels pointless. Why try if the deck is stacked? Why invest if others have such a head start? Why change if the system doesn't reward people like me? The comparison trap doesn't just slow you down. It gives you a story that makes staying still feel logical, even righteous. And that's the most dangerous kind of trap, the one that feels justified. The third trap is the most personal. I call it the comfort of almost. Almost is a very comfortable place to live. You're not failing, you're almost succeeding. You're not giving up, you're just waiting for the right moment. You're not stuck, you're in transition. Almost protects you from having to fully commit, because full commitment means full accountability. If you go all in and it doesn't work, there's nowhere to hide. But if you stay in almost, you can always say you were just about to. You were just getting ready. You were just waiting for things to settle down. Almost is the gap between intention and action, and most people live their entire financial lives in that gap. Not because they don't want more, but because almost feels safer than the alternative. Here's what I want you to notice about these three traps. None of them look like giving up. Preparation looks like responsibility. Comparison looks like self-awareness. Almost looks like patience. They're all disguises. Sophisticated, convincing disguises for the same underlying thing, fear. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that paralyzes you completely. The quiet kind. The kind that whispers reasonable things. The kind that always has a good explanation. The kind that keeps you exactly where you are, while making you feel like you're almost somewhere else. Recognizing the trap is not the same as escaping it, but you cannot escape what you cannot see. And most people spend their entire lives inside these traps, without ever knowing the name of the thing that's holding them back. Now you do. So what actually works? Not in theory, not in the self-help version of this conversation, in practice, in real life. For real people with real constraints and real histories, what actually moves people forward? I've thought about this for a long time, and the honest answer is simpler than most people expect, and harder than most people want. It starts with a decision, not a resolution, not a goal, not a plan, a decision. There's a difference. A resolution says, I want things to be different. A goal says, here's what different looks like. A plan says, here's how I'll get there. A decision says, I am no longer the person who doesn't do this. Do you feel the difference? A decision is an identity shift. It's not about what you're going to do. It's about who you're choosing to become. And identity shifts, real ones, don't come from information. They come from moments. Moments where something clicks, where the cost of staying the same suddenly feels higher than the cost of changing, where you look at the gap between who you are and who you want to be and decide that the gap is no longer acceptable, not motivationally, not emotionally, structurally. The decision becomes part of how you see yourself, and once that happens, behavior follows naturally, not perfectly, not without struggle, but naturally, because you're no longer fighting your identity to act differently. Your identity is now aligned with the action. Let me make this concrete. There's a difference between someone who says, "I'm trying to save more money," and someone who says, "I'm someone who lives below my means." Same behavior, completely different identity. The first person is fighting themselves every time they choose to save. The second person is just being themselves. One requires constant willpower. The other requires almost none, because the decision has already been made at the identity level. Now here's the practical question: how do you actually make that shift? How do you go from someone who is trying to change to someone who has changed? It starts with evidence, small evidence, consistent evidence, evidence that you are, in fact, the kind of person you are trying to become. Every time you make a financial decision that aligns with who you want to be, no matter how small, you cast a vote for that identity. You put $1 away when you didn't have to, vote. You read something about investing instead of scrolling, vote. You had a difficult conversation about money that you'd been avoiding, vote. None of these feel significant in the moment, but they accumulate, and over time, the accumulation of votes becomes the evidence, and the evidence becomes the belief, and the belief becomes the identity, and the identity changes the behavior. Not through willpower, not through discipline, not through motivation, through becoming. This is the shift most people never make. Not because they can't, but because nobody ever told them that this was the actual work. They were told to budget better, to invest smarter, to set clearer goals, all of which matter, but none of which address the root. The root is always identity. Who do you believe you are in relation to money? And more importantly, who are you willing to decide to become? Because that decision, made quietly, privately, without fanfare, is where everything actually begins. Not the app you download, not the account you open, not the book you read, the decision. The moment you stop negotiating with the version of yourself that keeps pulling you back and choose, clearly, finally, completely, to become someone different, that moment is available to you, right now, not someday, not when the circumstances are better, not when you feel more ready, now. From exactly where you are, with exactly what you have, the only thing standing between you and that moment is the decision to have it. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to pause for just a moment, not to recap, not to summarize, just to say something directly. What we've been talking about today isn't easy to sit with. Identity, the traps we live inside without knowing, the decisions we keep almost making. This isn't the kind of content that feels comfortable. It's the kind that makes you look at things you've been avoiding, and that takes something. It takes a willingness to be honest with yourself that most people don't bring to a YouTube video. You brought it, and that matters more than you might think. If this is the kind of conversation you want more of, if this channel is giving you something that other places aren't, I want to invite you to subscribe. Not because the number matters, but because what we're building here is a body of work. A series of honest conversations about money, identity, and the life you're trying to build. Each video stands alone, but together they form something larger, a map, not of markets or portfolios, but of the inner landscape that determines everything else. That's what the bigger picture is about. If that resonates, you know what to do. Now, let's talk about what moving forward actually looks like, because understanding the traps is one thing, walking out of them is another, and the distance between understanding and action is exactly where most people get stuck. Again. So let me give you something concrete. 3 things you can do, not someday, not next month, this week. The first, name your identity. Not who you want to be eventually, who you are deciding to be now. Write it down. not a goal, an identity statement. I am someone who makes deliberate financial decisions. I am someone who invests consistently regardless of how I feel. I am someone who lives below my means without feeling deprived. Choose one, write it down, read it every morning for 30 days. Not because affirmations are magic, but because repetition shapes belief, and belief shapes identity, and identity shapes behavior. The second, cast one vote today. One small action that aligns with the identity you just named, not a dramatic overhaul, not a complete lifestyle change. One vote. Transfer $10 to a savings account. Read one article about a financial concept you've been avoiding. Have one conversation you've been postponing. One thing. Because one vote is how it starts. Always. The third. Identify which trap you're in. Preparation, comparison, almost. Be honest. Not judgmental, just honest. Because you cannot walk out of a trap you haven't named, and naming it, clearly, specifically, without excuses, is the beginning of something different. These three things won't transform your financial life this week, but they will do something more important. They will begin to shift the story you tell about who you are, the story that determines everything else, and shifting that story, even slightly, changes the trajectory, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. A ship that changes course by 2 degrees arrives at a different continent, not today, not next week, but eventually. And eventually, for the decisions that matter most in life, is exactly when it counts. We started today with a simple observation. Most people aren't lazy, most people aren't unintelligent, most people aren't unlucky, and yet, most people never move forward. Not in the way they imagined, not to the place they kept describing, not with the financial life they told themselves was coming. And now you know why. Not because of circumstances, not because of the market, not because of timing or luck or the absence of the right information, because of something quieter than all of that. The story, the identity, the invisible architecture of belief that determines, more than any external factor, what a person does and doesn't do with their money, with their time, with their life. I want to say something about this that I think is important. Knowing this doesn't make you immune to it, yet understanding the traps doesn't mean you won't fall into them. Recognizing the identity question doesn't mean you've answered it. Knowledge is the beginning, not the destination. The destination is the decision. The moment you stop treating your financial life as something that happens to you and start treating it as something you are actively constructing, decision by decision, vote by vote, day by day. That shift, from passenger to architect, is the most significant financial move most people will ever make. More significant than any investment, more significant than any strategy, more significant than any piece of advice anyone will ever give you, because everything else depends on it. The investments only work if you make them consistently. The strategy only works if you follow it through the uncomfortable moments. The advice only works if you actually take it. And all of that requires the thing we talked about today, identity, the decision about who you are and who you're no longer willing not to be. Let me leave you with something to sit with. Not a task, not a to-do list, not a number to calculate, just a question. If the person you're becoming, the one you're deciding to be right now, made every financial decision for the next 10 years, where would you be? Not the person you've been, not the person you were before this conversation, the person you're choosing to become. Where does that person end up? Sit with that question. Let it be uncomfortable if it needs to be. Let it be hopeful if that's what comes up. But let it be honest. Because the honest answer to that question is the clearest picture of what's possible for you. Not what's possible in theory, not what's possible for other people. For you, from exactly where you are, with exactly what you have, starting exactly when you decide to. If this conversation stayed with you, if something here shifted the way you see yourself in relation to money, share it. Not for the channel, not for the numbers, for the person in your life who is stuck in one of those traps right now and doesn't know it. The friend who keeps preparing but never starting. The person you love who compares themselves to everyone else and concludes they've already lost. The one who has been living in almost for so long they've forgotten what commitment feels like. Send it to them. And if something came up for you today, a realization, a question, something you want to say out loud, leave it in the comments. Tell me which trap you recognized yourself in. Tell me what the decision looks like for you. Tell me what you want us to talk about next. This channel exists because of that conversation, the one that happens after the video ends, in the quiet, when it's just you and the question. That's where the real work begins. This is the bigger picture, and moving forward was never about the destination. It was always about the decision to begin.